So picture this. It's the middle of the night.
Pitch black outside.
Right, pitch black. You are cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet over the dark, sprawling waters of the Mediterranean Sea. Inside the cabin, it is incredibly quiet. The lights are dimmed. Most of the passengers are asleep, wrapped in blankets.
A totally normal flight.
Exactly. Up front, the autopilot is engaged. It is the absolute definition of aviation routine. But then, inside the cockpit, the silence is broken by a hiss.
Just out of nowhere.
Yeah, a hiss, then a loud pop. A second hiss. Suddenly, someone in the cockpit screams, "Fire!" And then total chaos. Minutes later, an Airbus A320 carrying 66 people vanishes entirely from radar screens, just plunging into the sea.
It's the ultimate nightmare scenario in commercial aviation. A highly sophisticated, modern aircraft simply dropping out of the sky without a single distress call to air traffic control.
And the twist to this story, the thing that makes this incredibly baffling, is that this happened back in 2016. But today, for this deep dive, we are looking at a newly updated database report from the Aviation Safety Network.
Which is a fantastic resource, by the way.
It really is. And it reveals that 8 years after this tragedy, 2 world-renowned investigating agencies looking at the exact same black box data from the bottom of the sea have published completely contradictory reports.
Which is pretty rare, at this level of investigation.
Exactly. We are talking about a total fundamental divergence in reality. One agency says it was a terrorist bomb. The other says it was a catastrophic cockpit malfunction.
Which is why this specific case is so critical to examine. We are unpacking the timeline of EgyptAir Flight 804. And this deep dive is really a masterclass in the friction between the collection of raw, hard data and the flawed human interpretation of that data.
Because when you board a plane, you trust that the entire aviation industry is learning from every past tragedy to make your current flight safer. I mean, that is the fundamental promise of accident investigation.
Right, the system's supposed to correct itself.
But what happens to that safety net when the experts look at the same ones and zeros and literally cannot agree on what brought the plane down?
It's a huge problem. And to figure out how a modern airliner falls out of the sky, you have to look at the machine itself.
Right. So is this an ancient jet just past its expiration date?
Not at all. To ground the story, we really have to look at the specific profile of this aircraft. This is an Airbus A320, registration SU-GCC, operated by EgyptAir.
Okay.
It was manufactured in 2003, which means it had logged over 48,000 flight hours.
Which is a lot. Great.
In the aviation world, that is a solid midlife commercial jet. It wasn't fresh off the line, obviously, but it was nowhere near retirement either.
Wait, I saw in the case file that it had an engine failure near Cairo a few years prior, back in 2013. Does an engine failure 3 years ago actually matter here, or is that just background noise for a plane with 48,000 hours?
It is mostly background noise, yeah. But it serves as a crucial reminder. I mean, these are complex physical machines subject to intense wear, tear, and maintenance cycles. That 2013 incident was minor and safely handled. And spoiler alert, the engines are not the culprit in this disaster. But it establishes that this machine had a history,
Okay, so let's unpack this and move to the timeline of the final flight. Thursday, May 19th, 2016. Flight MS-804 departs from Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport, heading for Cairo.
And it takes off late.
Right, at 23:21 local time in Paris, so we are dealing with a red-eye flight flying through the dark.
Yes. And by 23:22 UTC, the aircraft enters Greek airspace at flight level 370.
Let me pause you there just so we are all on the same page. UTC, that stands for Coordinated Universal Time. That is the global standard for aviation, right?
Exactly.
So we are looking at a universal, standardized timeline, regardless of what time zone the plane is flying over.
That is correct. So at 23:22 UTC, they are cruising at 37,000 feet. The air is thin. They are well above any significant weather systems.
It's smooth sailing.
Very smooth. And the workload for the flight crew is at its absolute lowest point in the entire journey.
It is like driving on a completely empty straight highway at 2 in the morning. The cruise control is on. It is quiet. Everything is nominal. In fact, the transcripts show they do a completely normal, relaxed radio check at 23:48 UTC.
Yeah, no panic, no warnings, just standard aviation chatter.
But then we hit the critical window.
Right. And I want to break down this timeline second by second, because the speed at which this disaster unfolds is staggering.
It's incredibly fast.
It goes from total calm to absolute catastrophe in less than 3 minutes. At 0.25 and 24 seconds UTC, the cockpit voice recorder picks up a hissing sound.
Just a hiss, like a pressurized can of air being opened?
Something similar, yes, like escaping air or gas,
Yeah.
followed almost immediately by a distinct pop and then a second hissing sound.
Okay.
At that exact moment, the voice recorder captures the captain, the co-pilot, and a flight attendant who happen to be sitting in the cockpit jump seat.
All three of them.
All three of them exclaim, "Fire!" simultaneously,
Mm-hmm.
and the co-pilot urgently calls for a fire extinguisher.
So they clearly know there is a fire. I mean, they can see it or smell it immediately, and they are moving to fight it. But what I don't understand is, what is the plane telling them? Modern aircraft are basically flying computer networks. There have to be alarms blaring the second a fire starts.
Well, you would think so. But there is a terrifying 34-second gap between when the crew yells "fire" and when the plane's computers actually start registering the catastrophe.
34 seconds in an emergency is a lifetime.
It really is. It isn't until 0.25 and 58 seconds that a cascade of warnings absolutely floods the flight data recorder.
What kind of warnings?
First, the system registers lavatory smoke. Then avionics smoke.
Wait, the avionics bay?
Yeah, that's the electronics compartment located beneath the cockpit floor. And then the master warnings start going off.
Master warnings, that is the aircraft essentially screaming that multiple critical systems are failing all at once, right?
Exactly.
But hold on, if the fire's in the cockpit with the pilots, why is the first alarm for the lavatory?
That is one of the key data points investigators had to wrestle with. The smoke could have been drawn through the ventilation system, triggering sensors in adjacent zones sequentially.
Oh, that makes sense.
But what we do know is that the sequence of warnings continues rapidly. The electrical buses start failing one by one.
The electrical buses, basically the main power arteries of the plane's computer systems. If those go down, the plane starts going blind.
And deaf. At 0.27 and 23 seconds, air traffic control instructs the flight to contact Cairo. But there's just total silence.
The crew never replies.
No. And this is where the physical behavior of the plane becomes incredibly violent.
Right, because according to the military radar data picking them up, the aircraft suddenly banks in a sharp 90-degree left turn.
Which is massive.
A 90-degree bank for a commercial airliner at 37,000 feet is a huge, violent maneuver. You do not do that unless you were dodging another plane.
And it doesn't stop there.
No, it is immediately followed by a dizzying 360-degree turn to the right, plunging from 37,000 feet all the way down to 15,000 feet before it completely vanishes off the radar screens.
It just drops out of the sky, impacting the surface of the Mediterranean Sea. All 66 people on board are killed.
It's just devastating. Now, normally, when a tragedy like this happens over open water, the agonizing part is finding the black boxes, right?
Usually, yes, it can take months or years.
But they actually found them relatively quickly in this case. They recovered both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder from the seabed just about a month later, in June of 2016.
They did. And that is where the timeline of the investigation takes a very strange turn.
Yeah, because you have the raw data, you have the voice recordings, you have physical wreckage. You would assume the mystery would be solved relatively quickly.
But it wasn't. The final report from the Egyptian Investigating Authority wasn't published until October 30th, 2024.
That is 8 years and 5 months later. Why the massive delay? I mean, if they had the boxes in a month, what were they looking at that took nearly a decade to parse out?
Well, the delay wasn't about extracting the data. It was about how to interpret what that specific sequence of ones and zeros actually meant. And this brings us to the official conclusion published by the Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority, or the ECAA.
Okay, let's look at the official Egyptian narrative. What did they actually conclude after 8 years of analysis?
So, the Egyptian investigators concluded that the aircraft's flight path became uncontrollable because both the aircraft systems and the flight crew were severely affected by a massive fire and smoke event.
Okay.
They state that the fire took place so quickly and with such intensity that the crew was disabled almost immediately.
Which does line up with the voice recorder, right? The hiss, the pop, the shout for the fire extinguisher, and then the violent dive. But what caused the fire?
This is the crux of the global controversy. The Egyptian report officially states that the fire resulted from the effects of explosive materials located at the forward galley, which is just behind the rear section of the cockpit.
Explosives.
Yeah. They specifically claimed the chemical traces of TNT were found on the recovered remains and wreckage.
I have to stop you there. So the official stance of the Egyptian government is that this was an explosion, a terrorist bomb.
Yes.
If they found TNT, isn't it case closed? If you are listening to this and wondering how someone sneaks high explosives onto a plane at a major European airport, you aren't the only one. But if the chemical evidence is there, how is there even a debate?
Because finding microscopic chemical traces on wreckage that has been sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea for a month is incredibly complex. But more importantly, what's fascinating here is the French authorities, specifically the BEA, which is the French equivalent of the NTSB, pushed back against this conclusion incredibly hard.
We need to acknowledge the immense liability stakes at play here, too. France was heavily involved because the flight originated in Paris, and Airbus is a French company. If this crash was caused by a mechanical failure, Airbus faces immense scrutiny and liability. But if it was a bomb, the security at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport faces the fallout. So you have competing institutional frameworks looking at the exact same data. It explains the tension.
The stakes are incredibly high. And the Egyptian report claims that French experts were actually present for the discovery of the TNT and implies a shared consensus.
But the French disagree.
Totally. The BEA released a public statement strongly contradicting this. They stated that their experts were merely there as advisors and observers. They explicitly said they had neither the role nor the possibility of validating any findings concerning the presence of explosives on human remains.
Wow. So the French investigators are essentially saying, do not put our name on that conclusion. We did not verify that TNT.
It goes much deeper than just a procedural disagreement over who signed what paper, though. The BEA claims that assuming TNT was present actually distorts the facts of the crash. They argue that the explosives theory is a fundamentally unrealistic scenario. Wait, why? If a bomb goes off, it brings down the plane? How is that unrealistic? Because it is totally incompatible with the specific sequence of computer warnings and crew announcements on the black box recordings.
What do you mean?
Think about the mechanics of an explosion. If a bomb involving TNT detonates near the cockpit, it is an event of instantaneous devastation. It severs the electrical buses and the data cables in a millisecond.
I see. If a bomb goes off, the data recorders just stop. You wouldn't expect to hear the crew talking, shouting for an extinguisher, and you definitely wouldn't expect to see a 34-second delay before the alarms start triggering.
Exactly. And you wouldn't expect a sequential cascade of alarms, first the lavatory, then the avionics bay, then the master warnings.
Sure.
A sequential cascade implies a fire that is physically growing and spreading through the compartments, not a sudden explosive detonation that destroys everything at once.
So if the French investigators completely reject the bomb theory based on the data signature, what do they think happened? How do they explain the hissing, the pop, and the sudden inferno that brings down an airliner?
The BEA has proposed a terrifying alternative timeline. They believe the catalyst was a high-pressure oxygen leak right inside the cockpit.
Oxygen, like from the emergency masks the pilots wear.
Yes. Every commercial airliner cockpit has a specialized emergency oxygen system for the crew. It is there to save their lives in case the cabin loses pressure, allowing them to breathe so they can fly the plane down to a safe altitude.
Right, the little masks that drop down. But for the pilots, they are much more robust.
Very robust and under very high pressure. The French investigators analyzed the acoustic signatures on the recordings and concluded that the sequence likely started with a severe leak of pressurized oxygen originating in the co-pilot's mask storage box.
What would cause that to just suddenly leak in the middle of a perfectly smooth flight?
They theorized it was either a mechanical component failure within the storage box itself, a failure in the upstream distribution system, or, and this is a chilling possibility, someone in the cockpit accidentally pressed the emergency knob on the co-pilot's oxygen mask while moving around or adjusting their seat.
Oh, wow. Just a completely accidental bump of a switch.
Yeah, it happens.
Okay, but I remember from high school chemistry that oxygen itself isn't flammable. You can't just light a tank of oxygen on fire.
You are absolutely right. Oxygen isn't flammable, but it is an incredibly powerful oxidizer. A fire needs three things: fuel, heat, and oxygen.
Right, the fire triangle.
Exactly.
Right.
When you introduce a high-pressure leak of 100% pure oxygen into an enclosed environment like a cockpit, it drastically lowers the ignition temperature of every single thing around it.
So it turns materials that are normally completely fire-resistant, like aviation-grade plastics and fabrics, into highly combustible fuel.
Right.
It's like if you have a tiny, smoldering spark, maybe from a shorted wire behind a panel or a lit cigarette, and you suddenly hit it with a blast of pure oxygen. It doesn't just catch fire. It turns a minor, barely noticeable issue into an unstoppable inferno instantly.
The BEA report uses very specific, horrifying phrasing to describe this mechanical reaction. They state that an oxygen-fed fire produces a characteristic noise comparable to a blowtorch.
A blowtorch. And that perfectly matches the intense hissing sound picked up on the cockpit voice recorder at 00.25 and 24 seconds.
Yes. The French theory suggests it doesn't even matter which came first, the spark or the oxygen leak. Once they combined, the fire was rapid, large-scale, and completely uncontrollable.
And the fire extinguishers?
The standard protective equipment and the small handheld fire extinguishers kept in a cockpit would have been utterly useless against a blowtorch effect fire fed by pressurized oxygen.
That explains the tragic irony here. The co-pilot asks for the extinguisher, but the situation deteriorates so fast that they can't even fight it. But I am still hung up on the violent maneuvers.
The turns, right.
Yeah. How does a fire in the cockpit cause the plane to violently bank 90 degrees left and then 360 degrees right? Did the pilots do that trying to descend to put the fire out?
The French analysis strongly suggests the plane did that on its own. The Airbus A320 operates on a fly-by-wire system.
Let's define that for the listener really quick. Fly-by-wire means there are no physical steel cables connecting the pilot's control stick to the flaps on the wings. It is all electronic.
Right.
The pilot moves the stick, a computer reads the input, and sends an electrical signal to motors on the wings to move the surfaces.
Correct. And the fire, burning like a blowtorch, would have rapidly melted through the computer power supply systems and the flight control computers located just below the cockpit floor.
Oh, no.
Yeah. When those systems lose power or the wires begin to melt together, the autopilot violently disconnects. The computer starts sending corrupted, random data to the wings.
So it is not the pilots violently yanking the yoke in a panic. It is like the plane's central nervous system is melting, and the muscles, the flaps and rudders are just twitching randomly as the wires cross and short circuit. That is horrifying.
It is a total loss of mechanical control.
But what about the crew? You said there was a captain, a co-pilot, and a flight attendant up there.
That is the lingering, haunting unknown of the French analysis. The BEA notes that after the initial shouts of fire and the call for the extinguisher, no further crew actions were recorded on any of the instruments.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The autopilot disconnected, but there were no recorded manual inputs on the flight controls to try and recover the aircraft from those violent turns.
Nothing. Not a single attempt to pull the plane out of the dive.
Nothing. The data just goes completely blank regarding human input. We still don't know if the crew was knocked unconscious immediately by the toxic smoke from the melting electronics, or if they stayed to fight the fire and were overcome.
Or maybe they fled the cockpit to escape the blowtorch effect and then couldn't get back in because the fire destroyed the electronic door mechanism.
Exactly. The data tells us exactly what the machine was doing, but it completely stops telling the human side of the story.
So we are sitting here today looking at the Aviation Safety Network database. We have an Egyptian report that says definitively this was an act of malice caused by TNT.
Yes.
And we have a French report that says definitively this was a catastrophic oxygen fire caused by a mechanical failure or human error.
It leaves the aviation community with a fractured consensus. In a highly regulated, precision-driven world where every single failure is supposed to result in a unified safety bulletin, we have two distinct official narratives coexisting simultaneously.
And if you are listening to this right now, it is a stark reminder. Aviation safety relies heavily on those indestructible orange boxes, yes. But it relies just as much on the human institutions that interpret that data. When national liability, institutional pride, and complex international relations get involved, the waters can become incredibly muddy, even with hard data in hand.
That is the ultimate takeaway here. The flight data recorders did their job flawlessly. They survived a violent impact and a month at the bottom of the sea.
They recorded everything.
They recorded every hiss, every alarm, and every final word. We have all the data in the world. And yet, the absolute truth of what doomed those 66 people remains heavily disputed.
It makes you wonder about the future of accident investigations. I mean, we are rapidly racing toward a world where artificial intelligence is used to analyze vast amounts of data.
Oh, for sure.
Will handing these black boxes over to an AI finally give us the cold, objective truth, completely stripped of human liability and national pride? Or will an AI system just inherit the blind spots and institutional pressures of the engineers who trained it?
It is a fascinating problem to consider.
The next time you look at an official report in the news, at work or in history, ask yourself, who is interpreting this data and what assumptions did they start with? We hope this deep dive gave you something to think about. Until next time, stay curious, keep asking questions, and never take the first interpretation as the only truth.